Hello, Pedro. This is my quick recording to introduce my short 10-minute talk. So I hope I'll share this idea with your group, and I'd be interested to hear what they think about it. Thank you. Hello. Hello, my name is Mark Costello, originally from Ireland, but I spent the last 16 years in New Zealand where I learned a lot about marine reserves. So I'm going to share an idea with you of how we can better manage the oceans more sustainably using marine reserves. So we know that we have, as a society, greatly changed the landscape and more intensively managed land, and the same is now happening with the oceans. So do we want the same type of future for the oceans, where the oceans are basically turned into a urban landscape full of farms? Or can we be a little bit more sustainable in managing the oceans? One way countries have tried to more sustainably manage the oceans is to create marine protected areas. And there's over 9,000 now, which sounds very good. But actually, most of these allow fishing. So it's kind of sustainable use. It's not really about conserving nature. And most of them don't work because if, as I'll point out in a later slide, if you remove all the top predators for the ecosystem, the whole fishery changes. And the ocean is different than land in this way. So actually now we only have 2.5% of the ocean area that even aims to be natural. And that's not accounting for enforcement or other issues. And most countries that are coastal, 3/4, have no marine reserves, that is, no take, no fishing MPAs. This video animation here shows the year that the maximum sustainable yield was reached in any fishery. And what it illustrates is the global impact of fisheries since the 1950s. And even before that, we had overfished many of the great whales of the world, which are now recovering because people have stopped killing them largely. So the ocean is not pristine. So are any modern fisheries sustainable? We hear a lot about sustainable fisheries in the literature, the scientific literature, and some fisheries are even certified to be sustainable. But I've been looking for the last few years and asking experts, and nobody can give me any data to show that any fish stock that's been managed is sustainable. The only perhaps example is the Pacific halibut fishery of the United States, which catches only 30% of its potential catch every year, and this is deliberate. And this 30% allows for environmental and other variability in the stock. So the idea that we can really manage fish stocks in the ocean, I suggest, is a delusion for the reasons I'll provide next. So modern fisheries are heavily motorized with massive nets. Hundreds and thousands of kilometers of long lines are put out in the ocean for hours and days, and dredges plow up the seabed, things that we would never permit on land. And this is based on an old-fashioned, what I call a naive utilitarian philosophy that we have dominion over nature, that we can do these things and that there will not be repercussions. The aim is to maximize yield. And an analogy is if you gave a lot of young men keys to fast sports cars and you told them to go for a drive, but they could only drive at the speed limit. Well, you can be sure that they would all drive over the speed limit. And this is what happens at fisheries. If a fishery is aiming to maximize its yield, they will catch more fish than they need to make sure that they maximize it. So while managing a wild fish population, I suggest, is both theoretically and practically impossible. It's a delusion. And the reason is we don't control the environment, we don't control the climate, we don't control the life cycle, parasites, the food that the fish eat, or any of these things. This is quite unlike farming. And in the ocean, we allow people to do almost anything. Whereas on land, we have much more restricted activities that we allow people to use nowadays. Here's examples on this slide. We can plow anywhere in the oceans almost unless it's prohibited. We can hunt all species or kill all species in the ocean unless they're specially protected, whereas on land it's the opposite. We only allow selected species to be hunted. But on the good side, the oceans will recover naturally because they're very connected and there's still some refuges of most species. So if we just stop these harmful impacts, the ocean will recover within 5 to 10 years in many areas. Whereas on land, we have had such devastating impacts already that it's very expensive to restore habitats and species populations on land. So the consequences, as you perhaps know, of this continued fishing and the bycatch is that top predators, things that, turtles, seabirds that are not even intended to be caught, are going extinct as collateral damage of fisheries. And the fisheries keep switching down from from bigger fish to smaller fish. There's an increase in the scavengers on the seabed and scavenging seabirds, and the food webs and ecosystems are altered, and we really don't know what the consequences of these changes will be. Will these ecosystems recover from the absence of fishing? And it looks like, from some examples in marine reserves, that the ecosystems can recover. However, the cod fishery is one case where maybe it won't recover. The cod fishery, as you know, in Atlantic Canada and the North Atlantic. So if we contrast fishing and farming, just to sit back and think of ourselves as citizens. So in farming, the farmer takes special care of his broodstock, the breeding animals, whereas in the sea, we kill them first because they're the biggest. Farmers take special care of the juveniles and the nursery areas and the food for their livestock, whereas in the sea, the nursery habitats are dredged and destroyed. And we pay no attention to what food is available for wild fish. We just assume that they will eat something. And farmers pay for all this. They pay for their broodstock, the seed, fertilizer, veterinary care, whereas in the fishing, they get everything for free. So it's a little like if you give people something for free, they don't really respect it or take care of it. So we need to take much more responsibility and ownership for our ocean life. And the other areas of subsidies is we do the opposite. On land, we now subsidize, the taxpayer pays money for farmers to protect nature. In the sea, we're doing the opposite. We're actually subsidizing fishermen to go and catch more fish. And this is the reason we can't compare land and ocean harvesting of resources. On land, we largely eat the herbivores and the plants. In the ocean, we're eating the top predators. So even the very first little bit of fishing, whether it's by subsistence fishers, sports fishing, or commercial fishing, removes the top predators and the biggest animals first, the animals that contribute most to next generations and really control the food web. So we're going from a current situation of largely unprotected oceans with insecure food security, collapsing fish stocks, impoverished biodiversity, degraded ecosystems, and people who are getting less and less resources from it. So a future, I suggest, is a more protected marine ecosystem. In this analysis, we can find no evidence that marine reserves cost anything more. In fact, they cost less to manage than non-fished areas because fishing has complex regulations which are expensive to police. We find overwhelming evidence that there's far more fish in marine reserves, that they spill over and benefit fisheries all around them. The fishermen know this, which is why they line up their fishing boats at the edges of marine reserves. And these benefits take a few years to take effect, but they're permanent, and it's just common sense. If you stop killing things, they will survive and reproduce and flourish. So one way of fishing the oceans, instead of having certain quotas for boats, is that you limit the fleet, but you also have some areas of the ocean where there's no fishing and allow these fish to spill out and enrich the fished areas around them. And I suggest these are the only solutions left to manage fisheries. And indigenous cultures in the Pacific Ocean and Southeast Asia, where my colleagues have worked, know this for a long time. They've always had a tradition of when a fish stock declines, that they stop fishing it, and they would the area would become a taboo or prohibited from fishing that animal or plant in the area. So this is just common sense. But for some reason, when we get more industrialized and clever in our European societies, we think we can manage these fisheries and we can control everything, but we can't, as the present COVID crisis clearly shows us all. Well, one of the advantages of creating marine reserves is that they guarantee a refuge for threatened and commercially important species, and they have tourism benefits. They also empower the local communities to manage those resources. So many of the Pacific Islands have done this, as I'll show in my next slides. And the Pacific Islanders are declaring large areas as marine protected areas. We also now know, we will know from these marine reserves, what an area is like without fishing. So then we know exactly what the impact of fishing is outside. And at the moment, what we've been doing for over 100 years has been this great experiment in the oceans by taking what we can and hoping that something will be left for future generations. And setting aside these marine reserves is not a strange idea, because on land we do this all the time. We set aside parks, hospitals, schools, museums, sports grounds, military areas, art galleries, all for the public good on public land with public expense. And the oceans is already owned by the people, not by the people that are using it. The Pacific has created many huge areas, and here is something that the Azores and the Atlantic Islands should also be considering, because by creating their entire exclusive economic zone as a marine protected area, and they're flipping the normal management scenario and saying we are protecting everything unless otherwise stated. So this is more or less the precautionary principle of what we do on land. This slide summarizes what I've just said in a way. So what the Pacific Islanders have done, and many of them listed up there, and more, some of the Pacific Islands that come under that are associated with European countries and United States of America, they usually allow the coastal communities to continue to catch fish for local consumption with small boats. This is local consumption for restaurants and people in the community. And any commercial fishing is strictly controlled and only permitted on the basis that they get statistics from the fishing boats, they have observers on them, and in many cases they're looking to actually charging more for these commercial fishing fleets than is normally the case, because these fleets will know that that area has a very rich fishing ground because the fishing is strictly controlled and managed. So these have sustainable social, economic and health benefits, and they benefit biodiversity and the planet and carbon sequestration in the oceans, because the more life is in the ocean, the more carbon it collects and sinks to the seabed. Thank you very much for listening. I have a website where I have some articles here about why no fishing is good in marine reserves and how to save ocean life. Thank you very much.